Hello, I'm Jim Cornwall, and this is the WalkingPost.com podcast. WalkingPost.com is the news website dedicated to walking, with all the latest on books, festivals, health, gear, events, trails, fitness, and more. This podcast is number 41, going out on February the 20th, 2026, that is, in case you've discovered this podcast many years from now. Absolutely nothing going on here, just doing interviews, watching a bit of Winter Olympics, looking out of the window, and the rain. Really looking forward to spring walking again, even though I could go walking in the rain. February the 20th is Comfy Day, Caregivers Day, and Love Your Pet Day. I think that every day is that for most of us. And it's Yukon Heritage Day. When I first moved to Canada, obviously I had studied, so I knew about the Yukon Territory. But then on the radio we had Yukon in the March Madness basketball. And it took me a minute to click that Yukon the Territory is not Yukon the University, Yukon being short for University of Connecticut. Now that could have been embarrassing. February the 20th in 1872 was the first performance of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, and it's the birthday of Rihanna, Ivana Trump, and Steely Dan's Walter Becker. So let's move on. Last time we chatted with Jason Lennox from the One Arrow Foundation, who last year launched the Recovery Road, a collective walk for mental health and substance use. This week we have another long-distance walker on the show from New York State, and the difference here is that Ken Posner walks barefoot. Obviously not all the time, but on hikes and for some running races. Before we get going, if you do have news, guest ideas, or even subjects to cover, or comments, or you want to advertise, please do get in touch via walkingpost.com, or you can just email me directly at jim@walkingpost.com. Okay, so let's go through some of the headlines of the news articles you may have missed that we had on walkingpost.com this past week. There's been funding for Irish landowners for path maintenance. Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, has received funding for new trails in the city, and Joma has evolved its outdoor footwear with mountain models. Americans have ranked walking as the top outdoor activity. The Great Glen Way in Scotland is set for a major upgrade with a new off-road route that will be safer and quieter. That section is alongside Loch Ness. A walking company franchise for children in the US called Hawks has secured funding to boost franchise expansion. Tickets are on sale for the Garstang Walking Festival 2026, and you can read all of these and more at walkingpost.com. So it's time for this week's chat, and the guest is an author, ultra-marathon runner, and barefoot hiker with a great story, or stories to tell. So let's welcome Ken Posner. Hi Ken, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast this week. I wonder if to start you can give us a little bit of a biography.
Well, Jim, I'm just another corporate worker, focused on strategy and investor relations in the financial services area. And I've been doing that for about 30 years. But along the way, I got into running and hiking, and the experiences were really meaningful to me, have been very meaningful. And so I've also, on the side, started writing about the experiences. I have a blog post and I've just published my second book. And so I'm trying to figure out how to spend more time writing and sharing and less time going through spreadsheets. Many of us face that challenge.
I know that from your blog and from other things that you go by the nickname of Barefoot Ken, which is pretty obvious because you walk barefoot. But how did that start, and why do you do that? Sounds painful.
Yeah, and if you went back in time and said, hey, Ken, you're going to emerge as a middle-aged barefoot hippie, I would have been surprised. I would have been like, why me? this is exactly how it happened, and it was very pragmatic. There was a very popular book that came out in the US. I'm sure you guys got it in Scotland and England as well. It's called Born to Run by Chris McDougall. It was published in 2009. It's actually, I think, the highest selling running book of all time, according to Amazon. And in the book, Chris McDougall said, hey, shoes are great, but they distort what would be our natural way of moving, the way our ancestors did before everybody had shoes. And by distorting your natural gait, they may predispose particularly runners to injury. And, runners are constantly getting injured. So I read this and I was like, well, that's an interesting idea. So he advocated barefoot running to restore your natural gait, your natural form. And as I said, I thought, well, that's interesting, but like whatever, until I started getting injured. And as I got into my 50s, some of these injuries began to turn chronic. And with hindsight, I now know that they were the result of bad alignment over many years. And so I said in a very pragmatic manner that I should experiment with a little bit of barefoot just to see if I can learn something that helps me, improve my natural form. So I did a short barefoot run. When I say short, I mean like 100 yards or something. And it was totally different. And the surprise was how much fun it was. And it's not always fun. It's not necessarily fun on rocks. And if it gets hot or cold, it can be very painful, but it's very intense. And you get this wild contrast between the rocks, which are painful, and the dirt or the moss or the smooth rocks, which are very pleasurable. So, I very quickly lost interest in shoes and transitioned to running and hiking barefoot and just never looked back. What I tell people, sometimes people are surprised that they see me on the trails without shoes and they ask why. And I give them this answer, which I think everybody gets. And I just say, hey, look, barefoot is the perfect antidote to too much screen time. And then everybody gets it. It's just that supernatural experience that, some of us are hungering for after hours, hunched over the keyboard.
Does that slow you down by being barefoot?
Yes, for sure. That's the hardest thing about it. If you're a typical modern person who's always in a rush, from demanding deadlines at work to having to drive the kids around to soccer practice or whatever it is, and a typical modern person drinking a lot of coffee, you're always in a rush. And barefoot, you're going to have to move slower. And so that, to me, was the hardest thing to get used to, because when there are rocks or difficult terrain, you just have to place your feet carefully. And, all the young people are going to go flying past you, and the old people are going to go flying past you too. And it is what it is. It's an activity that is less about, particularly out on the trails, it's less about covering super long distances and moving quickly. And it's more about taking your time and observing. And you feel more like you're part of the forest and less like you're just rushing through it. And so it can be frustrating, but to me, that's just been very, very addictive. And like I said, the antidote to the rest of life, which is, at full speed most of the time.
Are there any dangers associated with it? I don't mean health-wise, but...
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously your feet are unprotected. But here's what happens. Once you take your first step barefoot, you're going to switch back into mindfulness mode. You're going to pay attention to where you put your feet. Feet are very important. They will take care of themselves. If you're being too aggressive, they will slow you down and then they will stop you. I keep track in my training log. And so it's been like 10 or 11 years now. And I just crossed my 15,000th mile of barefoot running, hiking, and walking. And I really haven't had many injuries to speak of. Like I ran a trail race in Texas and I stepped on a thorn. Okay. So it hurt for a bit and I was hobbling around. I had to get some tweezers and pull it out and then I was fine. That's the kind of risk that you're facing, but as long as you're careful.
Did you have to change your walking technique at all? I mean, other than just being mindful and watching where you're stepping, does it change your gait?
Yes, it does. And I would draw a contrast between running and walking. If you want to transition to running barefoot, that's something you have to do slowly over time because the gait is a little bit different. and you might be asking tendons and ligaments to stretch, an extra millimeter or two in a different direction. And that's a lot for them. So if you rush into barefoot running, you do run the risk of injuries, but walking is pretty easy. And I lead some intro barefoot workshops, and people just show up, and the young people like fly off down the trail. And I'm like, hey, wait for me. And the older folks will take their time, but they're able to get up a mountain first time without shoes. So I think it's very natural. Now, what will happen is over time you will start to change. And so, for example, if you read physical therapists like Jay DeSherry, he writes about, seeing a lot of runners and other people who don't engage the big toe appropriately. And I remember reading that in his book on running years ago and going, that's interesting. But as I started walking and running barefoot, I noticed that, you start to really think about the big toe to balance out your feet, and that really activates the arch. So again, the challenge with shoes is they make it easy for your feet to be lazy, and you don't really feel the ground, and you don't necessarily activate the muscles the way you would naturally. So that would be an example. Another example is you might walk in a little tiny bit of a crouch to get your legs working as shock absorbers. And the other thing too is it really teaches core engagement. So your lower abdominals, the glutes in particular. And I remember physical therapists, they're always like, runners don't use their glutes. And I was like, well, that's other runners, not me. But, the barefoot practice has really made me, much more mindful of all the core muscles. And that's what we lose, right? When you sit all day and you wear shoes, you tend to degrade that core engagement, which is how your body negotiates, the rougher, more difficult terrain.
You mentioned the workshops. Is there a lot of interest in those?
Yeah, I mean, I did a hike with the Catskill 3500 Club, and we had about 6 or 7 people, and we went up a mountain. I did another workshop with the running group, and we had close to a dozen people show up. So it's interesting. Barefoot is very niche. It is totally not mainstream, and some people are just horrified. Jim, they're like, you can't do that. And you do run the risk if you go to like a coffee shop or a grocery store or something, you might get confronted and people will say, you can't do that. It's against the law. And there's no law against that says, you have to wear shoes. But people have these ideas about, sort of this social norms. But having said that, people are hungry for nature. They're hungry for a natural experience. And a lot of people, like they see me on the trails or at a race and they get it. I get all this positive feedback. People call me warrior and next level. And I'm like, no, this isn't next level. This is prior level. Or Mr. Natural or badass, or they just say respect, or they give me a fist bump. I was in this grocery store and this huge dude was at the same counter and he looked at me and he was like, that's grounding, isn't it? And grounding is a term that people use. And I said, he was like twice my size. So I was like, yes, sir. And he said, I got to do me some of that. So people get it. I have all these funny interactions. I was walking through Cincinnati and this woman saw me and she said, hey, you're just like me. And I was like, well, I'm not just like you. She said, you're a country babe. Nobody's ever called me a country babe before, but what her point was, she said she likes to walk barefoot too, and she likes to feel the ground under her feet. And she was teasing me a little bit, but yeah. So a lot of people get it. It's one of those things that most people are reluctant to try something new unless they're with a group or have somebody to tell them how to do it. So.
I think one of the interesting things about the internet and going online is that you can discover people that have the same kind of interests. You think that you're the only person in the world that does a certain thing, and then
Right.
You find that there are millions of them. Is there a barefoot walking community that you communicate with? And
Oh, for sure. And again, it's in today's world, you're unlikely to see people, but we're out there. And so there are groups on like Facebook. So there's barefoot running groups, there's barefoot hiking groups, There's a group called Society for Barefoot Living, which is more about barefoot as a lifestyle. So yeah, there's lots of groups and people around the world. I was just looking at a post, and I don't know where in Europe the woman lives. Her name sounded Czech, possibly, but she was just had pictures of herself out on a hike. She was hiking barefoot in snow all day. That's not something that necessarily I can do, and people's capabilities are different. So don't, for your listeners, don't rush out and try that without being very thoughtful and mindful about what you're doing. But, people have been barefoot for hundreds, thousands, millions of years. And, I was reading a book about a trek in Nepal, and the Sherpas and porters were barefoot even during the first snows of fall. Now, once they got up at altitude, they put on shoes, but they didn't bother when it first started to snow. I'll tell you something funny. I discovered my mom mentioned my great grandmother, Bessie, when she grew up, she was barefoot. And she grew up in Eastern Europe. Why was she barefoot? She was an orphan. Nobody had shoes to share with an orphan. So, shoes have been around for a while, but that doesn't mean everybody had them.
I wonder if you could tell me a bit about some of your barefoot adventures, like you've done the long path and the John Muir Trail. I realized when I wrote that question that it kind of gives the impression that you somehow see it differently to everybody else, but it's the same trail. But
it is the same trail. Now, the long path I ran in 2013, and I did that in shoes. So that was before I became this weird middle-aged barefoot hippie. But the John Muir Trail I did barefoot. And actually, I got the idea, and for your listeners who are not familiar with it, it's a 210-mile trail through the High Sierra, which is the mountains of California. And it starts in Yosemite and goes all the way down to Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain in the continental U.S. at just under 15,000 feet or around 5,000 meters. And so I got the idea. I was flying on a business trip from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and it was early evening, and I looked out the window and I saw the High Sierra, and it was bathed in alpenglow. So it was turning pink and a pearly color, and I saw that and I was like, wow. And I recalled that John Muir had given a nickname to the High Sierra. He called it the Range of Light. And I totally got it. And I was like, I have to go out there and see this mountain range close up and experience it the way John Muir did. So in 2020, during the pandemic, I went out and I completed the 210-mile trail, and I did it mostly barefoot. By the way, I was just at this point getting into barefoot hiking, and sort of on a whim, I just decided to do it barefoot, and I had no idea what the trails would be like. So it was a huge adventure for me. And the interesting thing is the trails are beautiful, sandy, a very soft gray sand, and very comfortable to walk on in the valleys. But when you go over the mountain passes, they're all rock and quite difficult. So on this trip, I made it about 70% of the way barefoot. And there were a few spots where I had to put on shoes. And there was one point in particular, which I remember I was going on a steep downhill. And downhill is harder barefoot because you can't run down. You can't bomb down. You've got to lower yourself down. And when you're just starting out, that's actually harder than going up. So it was downhill. It was a mix of sand and rocks. And it had a southern aspect. So it was getting the full brunt of the sun. And of course, I showed up at like 11:30 in the morning and the sand was getting really hot. So I couldn't. I mean, it would have taken me all day and all night to get down that. So I put on shoes. I had a great experience nonetheless. But Jim, I guess I'm a stubborn guy because I wanted to do it barefoot, and 70% is not the same as 100%. So I came back the next year. And this time I did better. I got about 80% of it done, but I had some logistics, resupply problems. So I came back one more time in 2022, and I gave myself a few extra days. And I arranged a mule train to drop off my resupply, which is the best way to do it. And I did the whole thing. And it ended up being one of the most difficult, but one of the most meaningful experiences in my life. And there were points where it was fun, and there were points where it was hard. And I just thought back to, like I was saying, our ancestors. If you go back far enough, they didn't have shoes, or sometimes they did. And there would have been times when they had to cover long distances and their feet would have hurt, but they would have had to keep going. And that was what I was experiencing. So I felt this real sense of connection to the past. And then the other thing that was sort of remarkable about the experience, when I finally got to the southern terminus and finished the trail, I went down and hung out in a little town called Lone Pine in the desert beneath the mountains, just for a couple of days. And I had this strange feeling of stillness. Like for a day or two, the world just became totally quiet. And then after a day or two, all the social media alerts started beeping again and all the noise came rushing back. And I just thought, there is this stillness out there that many of us seek, but you may have to do something very natural to obtain it. So that was my experience. And so the John Muir Trail was a very, very special experience for me.
And before we started, I was mentioning the John Muir Trail or the John Muir Way in Scotland. Is that on the bucket list?
Well, it is now. I'm a big fan of John Muir, as many people are in the U.S. And as we were talking, he thought it was really important for people to connect with nature, and that's what you and your podcast and your son with your videos, you're trying to remind people of that too, and that's what I'm trying to do too. And I don't know, Jim, as I get older, I need, more nature, not less. And so I'm very appreciative as a U.S. citizen for the work that John Muir did that resulted in large sections of the High Sierra being preserved. Can you imagine if, they could have turned it into a shopping mall and that would have not been a good outcome?
Although having said that, I guess there are legislation going on to try and reverse some of it now, so that's not necessarily a good thing. But
by the way, I live in New York, and New York is a real conservation success story. And we have beautiful areas like the Catskills and the Adirondacks that were preserved by active government. But it's not just that. There are a number of not-for-profit organizations that are active in New York working on conservation. So I was part of an effort with a group of organizations. We raised altogether about $500,000 to buy 100 acres that contained a beautiful waterfall, and just to make sure that would be permanently preserved. Because if a private landowner owns that land and decides not to let people in, then you lose access to one of the just most stunning, iconic waterfalls in the southern part of the state. So there's a lot of people work at that, and that's part of the New York success story, is both the government and these grassroots efforts to preserve. And, in some places we have thousands of acres preserved, and a lot of it was one small parcel at a time over decades.
You have something called the 1,000 Mountains Project. What's that?
Part of the story of what I've done in recent years, I started out doing a lot of ultra marathons, and I was trying to go after records in some cases. But as I mentioned, as I got older, I started to struggle with injuries, and that's part of the reason I adopted the barefoot practice. As I began to do more hiking, it wasn't just about trails like the John Muir Trail. I do a lot of peak bagging, what we call peak bagging. I think in Scotland you call them Munros.
Well, there's different levels depending on the height. Yeah, but the Munros are the highest, although they're not very high. But
yeah. Well, we have similar mountains in New York. They're 1,000 meters, or in some cases they get up to 2,000 meters, but that's about it. So I did a project that involved a large number of climbs, and I did much of that barefoot, not in the winter, but in the summer, in the spring, and the fall. And so a couple of years ago, I was thinking about what should I do now? Because to me, projects are a way to organize. And actually, it's interesting, just as we started talking, there is an overlap between, the corporate, modern digital world and what we do in nature. And being organized is part of both worlds. It's a natural human skill. And so I love the idea of having a project that I can work on over time. And so the 1,000 Mountains Project is my personal goal of climbing 1,000 mountains barefoot in my lifetime before I get too old to do this. And right now the count is 604. And some of these mountains are really small, like they're not even 1,000 meters. They might be 300 or 400 meters. but they're still mountains. Somebody gave them the name of peak or mountain because they had that special quality. I've done some taller ones in the US, in Colorado, we have 14,000 footers, which would be about 3,000 meters, 3,000 or 3,500 meters. But it's just a multi-year project, and it gives me a lot of excitement as I think about, okay, it's 2026. Right now, there's snow everywhere, so I'm not doing anything. But where am I going to go this year, including my backyard here in New York, to maybe I'll go to California, or maybe I'll go back to Colorado. So it gives me a lot of excitement to think about what I'm going to do. And then I love making progress on my list. And then each experience is so special and so meaningful that it gives me that foundation to my life that if I face challenges at work or in other areas, at least I have the experiences in the mountains to fall back on.
Could you tell me a bit about your books? I guess you've just got a new one.
Yeah, and thank you, Jim. And I'll mention Chasing the Grid, which is available on Amazon, is my latest book, and it's about that peak bagging project I was just mentioning. This is from about 5 or 7 years ago, and I was starting to deal with injuries, and I was also facing some challenges at work. We had a bit of a slowdown, and the opportunities were diminishing, and I was feeling a little bit down in the dumps. And I discovered this project to hike a list of 35 high peaks in the Catskill Mountains, but there was a more advanced level, which was to do them in each month of the year. So it ends up being a big project. And this is called the grid. And the grid is like a table where you keep track of the mountains on the left and the months across the top, and you fill in this grid. It's a total of 420 climbs. So it's a big project. And it took me 2 years to finish it off. But that's the story of this book. And it was, again, such a meaningful experience for me. It was a chance to really get to know the mountains well, because you do each of them in all times of the year. And along the way, you get to learn about yourself. And you learn about the natural side of yourself that you experience in a natural environment. And it was very meaningful to me. And so part of the experience was the change I went through, because I started this project being more of a conventional ultra runner. And by the time I was done, I had become a minimalist and a barefoot hiker and runner. And that was part of the transformation that the mountains caused me to go through. And, you can, if you let them, the mountains will teach you about yourself. That's the point of the book. The other book I'd mentioned, this is a few years back, but we talked about the long path. This is called Running the Long Path, and it's also on Amazon. And this was back in my shoe days, and it's about my efforts to set a new record on this trail. And so it includes the drama of running for 9 days and getting lost and rained on and facing porcupines and blisters and all the rest and running out of food. But at the same time, I'm trying to weave in the history of New York and the voices from the past, like John Muir or Emerson or Thoreau, who are other American transcendentalist heroes. And the transcendentalist movement was simply the view that nature is the source of energy and creativity. And even in the 19th century, they were warning that people were moving indoors, becoming sedentary, losing their connection with nature, and they saw that as a problem. If they were around today, they would be very surprised. And the real question for all of us today is, where are we going to draw our strength and our energy, from nature or from AI? And, there are people who think, well, we'll all merge with technology, and they may be right. But my bet is, for as long as I'm around, that my bet is that I actually need to stay deeply connected with nature to be effective in life.
Probably a lot of people are waiting for, elevators or walkways up all of those mountains.
Let me make one last comment on Barefoot, if I could, because, Jim, there's ultra marathons and, people through hike the Appalachian Trail, which is 3,000 miles. So there are challenges for the very fit and often the very young. But with Barefoot, and this is what I think your listeners might appreciate, Barefoot creates the natural connection in the intensity. And you could go for a short walk in the forest, and you might get as much benefit as somebody running themselves to pieces, right? So it's not so much about distance, it's about the connection which you feel through your feet, as well as observing and hearing and smelling and feeling. So I think my part of the reason I try to share these experiences, I think a lot of people would actually find barefoot very accessible and enjoyable if they were encouraged to give it a try. If I make it out to the John Muir way, I'll look you up and see if you and your son want to give it a short, easy try.
Well, one of the things I was just going to say about Scotland, obviously we have listeners everywhere, but one of the things about Scotland is there's a lot of, as you probably found out on the West Highland Way, is that there's a lot of kind of marshy land where it's very soft. So those would be sections where barefoot would probably have that exact feeling. You'd feel you'd feel the moisture and the moss and all of that underneath your toes. So that would be good.
Let's talk about what's really gross. That's soggy shoes and socks, right? So whereas in bare feet, you just walk through it all and it all rolls off and your feet dry off. Anyhow, so that's my pitch to your listeners.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and I think as well, sometimes I know that when you get tired, you could care less, but when you start a trail, often the first couple of miles, if you come to a muddy bit or a bit with water going across it, you kind of step over it or try and go around it. And I assume that when you're barefoot, you just don't care. You would just go straight through the middle of that. So that's probably another good thing, is you don't get all hung up on the mud and the water.
Right. As long as it's not too deep. There are some trails in the Adirondacks where the mud pits are like knee deep, and so they lay really thin sapling trunks across the top, and so you have to tiptoe across like you're on a balance beam. So nobody wants to sink up to their knees in mud. But yeah, otherwise it's not a problem.
I noticed as well that you're a board member for the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference. Could you tell me a bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. The Trail Conference is a not-for-profit organization, and its main purpose is to maintain the trails in the Hudson Valley of New York and also New Jersey. And so we have a really sizable workforce of volunteers. We have 2,000 volunteers, and we are responsible for maintaining, around 2,100 miles of trails. And, maintaining means going out, mostly clipping back the vegetation, because it will eventually reclaim the trail if you don't trim it, and painting blazes, and if trees fall down, calling a crew of chainsawyers. And we also build trails and we publish maps. I mentioned the Long Path. That's a 350-mile trail in New York, and the Trail Conference developed it and maintains it. And that's what I was running in the book I mentioned, Running the Long Path. And so I would invite you, Jim, or any of your listeners to come visit us in New York and check out the Long Path. It's a medium-sized trail, 350 miles, but it goes through the most lovely areas of the Hudson Valley, the Catskills, Harriman State Park, the Palisades overlooking the Hudson River. And, we have spectacular foliage in the fall, and the spring and summer are very mild. If anybody is interested, have them contact me, and I'll set them up with volunteers in the website, which has all the information so they can plan their trip.
Sure, definitely a beautiful part of the world. I used to live in Ontario, close to Buffalo, so we'd be off in New York State quite often. I think there's, especially outside, even within the US, there's a bit of a impression that New York State is New York City and not very much else, and that's just a very tiny part of the state, which is, you want to get across the fact that there's the Adirondacks and the Finger Lakes and there's the Western New York. There's even Long Island has some amazing walks. So.
Well, New York needs to work on we need to work on our marketing a little bit, but The long path actually starts in New York City. And so the amazing thing about it is you get the experience of escaping the sprawl. And the farther north you go, the more remote and wild and quiet it gets. So it's very different from the John Muir trails. It's a very different experience. We had an English fellow show up in the early 19th century, Thomas Cole, who was a painter. And he fell in love with the Catskills, which are sort of at the halfway point for the long path. He said something, which is one of my favorite quotes. He said, "We still live in the garden. The wall that shuts us out from Eden is simply our own ignorance and folly." And so he felt that the Hudson Valley, where the long path goes through, sort of is the Garden of Eden if we would just open our eyes and recognize it.
So what's next on your list of either trails or book projects?
Well, I'm going to keep working on the Thousand Mountains project, which has become a big passion for me. I was just out in Phoenix, Arizona over the winter since it's too cold here. And I had some fabulous experiences there. And although, the goal is not to rush through it, it's meant to be a multi-year project. And I'm still trying to keep up with my running. So I've got a couple of races later this month out in Nevada. I struggle with this problem like many of us do, trying to find balance in life. And I love running and I love hiking. And so I struggle to balance the two. And then there's work and other things as well, but that's what's next for me.
Wow, I can walk barefoot from the bedroom to the kitchen. On the bright side, with such big feet, I wouldn't have to worry about not being able to find the right size shoes. Amazing feats there, and Ken is a really humble person, so his achievements really are hugely impressive. On the website, you can check out a link to some of his work and maybe even pick up one of his books off Amazon. I have to agree with Ken that New York State is totally amazing as a place for hiking. It's got Niagara Falls at one end, New York City pretty much at the other, and lots of incredible scenery in between. So that will just about do it for this week. If you do have news or suggestions for podcast guests, please do get in touch through jim@walkingpost.com. I'm always looking for guests, whether it's about a new trail, a new book, new equipment, or someone like Ken who has done an amazing, unusual, or interesting walk somewhere. And we have a few more of those coming up in the coming weeks. So I hope you enjoyed this week's walkingpost.com podcast, and I hope you have a great week ahead, hopefully with a walk somewhere. Don't forget your gloves if it's chilly. Until next time, happy trails. Walking Post from walkingpost.com is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.